Hello, hello, hello. All right. We are into the first week of November now. Things are quickly coming to an end. And don't forget, whether you're doing a book review for me or a podcast review for me, those are due this month, according to which class you're in, when it's due. So check on the syllabus. All right, this week we are doing the Old South. All right. This is a thematic lecture. We are focusing on the Old South. We're going to be talking about it from basically the colonial time frame up to the time of the Civil War. So we're kind of doing a quick overview of the Old South from the 1700s through the 1800s. All right. The key points I want you to focus on today: um, sources of difference. In other words, the sources of difference between the North and the South. Also, myth versus reality. One of the things with the Old South, it is shrouded in legends, tall tales, myths. A lot of the history you grew up learning is more myth than fact. And maybe, if we get that far, King Cotton. All right, so today, sources of difference, maybe King Cotton, but we'll do sources of difference and also myth versus reality. All right, so to start with, you got to start it by saying Southerners are a mythological people, created half out of dream, half out of slander, who live in a still imaginary land. All right, that is from a intellectual history book back in the 1960s. It's called Cavalier and Yankee, but it's a very true statement. Yeah. All right, listen to it. Southerners are a mythological people, created half out of dream, half out of slander, who live in a still imaginary land. All right, so mythological people. The idea of the field slaves, the domestic slaves, the planters, the Southern Belle, um, all of these figures, and we'll talk about them. The Southern farmer. All of these figures are just steeped in myth, and the stories that have been passed down and the stories that you've read in a lot of the history books really aggrandize and fictionalize the Southern people. And that next statement, half out of dream, half out of slander. All right. Um, Part of it is talking bad about Southerners and the Southern ways that would come up in the West, Westerners and Northerners talking about the, Southern ways of life. They're so horrible and how they must be horrible people. So some of the stories come out of, slander, and the other half out of dream. Um, One of the things you'll see that becomes very popular during the mid 1800s, during the 40s, 50s, is that people have started urbanizing in larger and larger numbers. They're leaving the farm, they're going to the city, they're working in the cities, and they become nostalgic for the farm. They start thinking about the way things used to be, and they're terrified. They're going into the unknown. They don't understand the world around them. They don't know what's happening. They don't know what's going to happen. So they start remembering the good old days of back on the farm. And the South was still back on the farm. So these Northerners that were becoming industrialized and urbanized aggrandized the South. And in the books, in the romance books and everything else, it was always picturing, this Southern planter that took very good care of his slaves and his kids. He had the big white house, everything anybody could ever need or want, lots of beautiful land. They just made it, they just turned it into this ideal. So You get it half out of dream, half out of slander, and that lives in a still imaginary land. All right, imaginary land is what's depicted as the Old South. The magnolia trees, the live oaks with the moss, the big white plantation house with the columns on the hill, all of those kind of things. The southern rivers, the landscapes. Just, you can see it in the movies and in descriptions in the novels of the time and in descriptions of the Old South in novels now. This aggrandized, I mean, really beautified world of the South. So, just getting into it, and just I needed to start with that because most of what we're doing today is myth and reality. All right, fact versus fiction, so to speak. So, let's start with these sources of difference. The first way to go about this, and the first way I want to talk about this, is in 1796, Thomas Jefferson um, was the VP, and he was supposed to sit in the Senate and just, bring it to order. If they needed him, he would vote. But most of the time, he just sat there writing and watching everybody around him. And he wrote down in one of his jottings what he saw as the main characteristics of a Southerner and the main characteristics of a Northerner. All right. So that's what we're going to start with, is Jefferson's traits of Northerners and Southerners. Jefferson said that the Northerners were cool, cool, calm, collected. They were sober, not meaning it has nothing to do with alcohol. When they used it then, the idea of sober means they were very formal, very reserved. They were laborious, which meant hardworking. They worked very hard, and their life was focused on work. He said also they're extremely independent. They were interested, and by that he means that when they saw something they didn't understand or didn't know, they learned about it. They were, they were very curious and wanted to learn. Also, he said they were chicaning. I like this word. I think it's one we should bring back into our modern lexicon. Chicaning means tricky and deceiving. They were willing to lie, cheat, steal in getting their way. Also, that they were jealous of liberties and those of others, and that they were superstitious and hypocritical in their religion. Meaning they clung to old ways of belief, but at the same time really didn't practice their religion. So we've got the Northerners. All right. Now, let's hear Jefferson describe himself and the other Southerners. He said that they were fiery, meaning that they're extremely passionate, right? Also that they were voluptuary, which means that they were given over to the senses. It really means kind of like this. They enjoyed food, liquor, smells. They enjoyed things and a lot of it. They were, in some ways, not quite, but in some of them, decadent. So they were fiery, which means they were passionate, and they were voluptuary. They're also indolent. Indolent is basically what it means is extremely lazy. The Southerners were extremely lazy people. All right. Unsteady means that you could not depend on them. They'll do one thing one day and another thing the next. Also, that they're generous to a fault. They were candid. In other words, if you really want a Southerner's honest opinion, all you got to do that is ask. They will tell you exactly what they think. Also, Um, the Southerners were jealous of liberties and trampling. Well, they were jealous of their own liberties, but trampling of those of others. Just look how the South treated the African American slave. And also, the Southerners didn't have any religion but religion of the heart, what they felt, their emotion, their instinct. That was their religion. So we have these two really different groups of different types of people that the two regions helped create. And so, to start off with our sources of difference, we get Jefferson's ideas of what a Northerner and Southerner were. But going on in, let's talk about some more of these sources of difference. One is agrarian versus agriculturalism. I'm sorry, agrarianism versus industrialism. So we had the agriculture, we have industry. So that's a difference. Also, we have the rural versus the urban. All right. Another big thing that was pushed back then is you had this simplicity of life versus the materialism. The simplicity of life, if you lived on a farm, you had what you needed. You lived a simple life. Many Southerners derided the Northerners, the urban people, that they were materialistic. They had too much stuff and frivolous stuff, unneeded things. So, you also, of course, have slavery. By the by going into the 1700s on into the 1800s, most of the northern states outlawed slavery, but the South would keep it. And in the South, slavery was the foundation of society and the economy, which was nothing like what it was in the North. All right, another thing is geographic layout. The northern and southern states had different geography, different types of land, different layouts, so to speak. Another one was immigration. The South did not get a lot of immigrants. All right, Southerners tended to have been there from the 1600s and had moved around in the South, but most Southerners, their families had been there for a very long time, as opposed to the North. Places like Boston, New York, Philadelphia, you had immigrants pouring in all the time. So immigration was a major thing in Northern society, but really wasn't even really a thing at all in the South, the Old South. All right, so we've got our first slide of differences down. Next, of course, we need to talk about architecture. And right off the bat, everybody, when they think of the Old South, they think of the plantation home, or they think of, the steamboat, a plantation up on the hill, overlooking a river with a steamboat going by. People think of the slave quarters, the log cabin, Southern architecture. And in the North, you have the brownstones, you have the growth of cities, and a cityscape is very different than a country layout. So the architecture was different. You have the urban versus the rural. All right. Also, religion. Religion in the North tended to preach against slavery. Religion in the North, really, at different points, focused on the evils of the South, while as religion in the South illustrated it used the Bible to illustrate that slavery was around, it was normal, and there's nothing wrong with it. So the preachers backed the plantation owners. They promoted slavery. One of the things you'll see in the 1800s is that the Presbyterians, Methodists, especially those two, would split in half, would split to northern and southern ways because the northern churches didn't want slavery and the southern churches were pro slavery. So religion is very important, and both of them pushing, from the pulpit, different views on slavery. Also, culture and lifestyle, you know, what people ate, how people lived. You know, Southern culture was slower. It went with nature. The North was becoming a faster and faster pace. The city never sleeps, right? So you have this culture and lifestyle, this slow versus fast, the different types of food in the South compared to the different types of food in the North. Just basic ways of life that are different. Also, education. Like we talked about, education was very, very important during the 1800s and would be focused on a lot by politicians and by the people. And at this time, during the 1800s, the South was a lot more educated than the North. They had better schools, and the children knew more. You had more literacy in the South, more colleges in the South. More Southerners went to college than Northerners did. So you had the South with that slower pace, with that agricultural lifestyle. The Southerners tended to get a better education because they had time for it. Whereas in the North, you got a lot of immigrants coming over, and you have this mentality of everybody goes to work, man, woman, and child would be working in the factories, working at jobs, doing different things to make money. So you have a different emphasis. All right. Also, another push with these sources of difference is the masculine ethos. We're going to talk about the Charles Sumner and Preston Brooks incident. But to get into it, we have to talk about what it meant to be a man. All right. During the 1800s, you have this really big focus in the South of the perfect man is one that is both physical and mental. And he is a man of honor, right? He should be just as relaxed reading as he is fighting. And a Southern man's honor was a very important thing. If it was insulted, they were quick to duel. Remember our stories with Jackson, right? Andrew Jackson. So this honor was kind of based on medieval chivalry, Christianity, classical philosophy from the ancient Greeks, and a very rigid social hierarchy in the South. So if someone insulted you, your honor demanded that you have a duel, you have a fight, or you get an apology. And with this, you see the South has this penchant for the physical, or violence. Dueling was everywhere and was becoming a major, major issue. The North had moved past that dueling and everything like that a long time ago. They had pushed into more, the idea of discussion, negotiation, and talking things through instead of violence. So you get this in this Sumner Brooks beating. Charles Sumner was an extremely he was a very popular politician in the North, and he was just completely hardcore against slavery. He was always giving speeches trying to abolish slavery, and during 1854, during what's known as Bleeding Kansas, we'll talk about that later. Um, when that's going on, Charles Sumner gives a speech, The Crimes Against Kansas, and he calls out the Southerners, the Southern slave owner, and really, really is vicious with it. All right. He insults Preston Brooks's uncle. All right. His uncle was sick at the time, had just had a heart attack. He wasn't there. And Charles Sumner called Preston's uncle in league with the devil, a demon, you know, incendiary words in the Southern way of life. So Brooks challenged Sumner to a duel. Sumner just, it didn't register to him. He thought it was ridiculous. Basically, he told him, we live in a civilized society. That stuff is not the way of things. And just kind of blew him off, right? Didn't really take him seriously. And over the next few weeks, Brooks would do everything he could to try to get Sumner to duel or fight. But Sumner just wouldn't do it. So, in the end, what ends up happening is Brooks goes into the Senate with a cane, has his friends guard the door, surround them with guns so that nobody can get to them. He walks up to Sumner, challenges him again. Sumner just dismisses him, doesn't even look up. And then Brooks starts caning Charles Sumner. It was a vicious, brutal beating. He would beat him with the cane. Sumner was a really tall, lanky guy, and he was in that desk, and he couldn't get up, couldn't get away. So, Brooks was just beating on Sumner, and he was trapped in his desk. Finally, trying to get away and thrashing so much, the desk ripped up from the floor, and Sumner staggered away and fell. And then Brooks just kept beating him, finally breaking his cane. And then he would beat him some more with the broken part of the cane, and then start pounding on him. In the end, after it was done, he said he had applied the proper licks. He said he got in 39 hard strikes, and that was good enough for honor. And he got up and walked away and left Sumner in a bloody pool. Sumner never really would recover from that beating, mentally or physically. It was a horrific beating. However, most of the senators, most of the men, they didn't really care that much. It was a more violent culture back then. Sumner would be reprimanded, but he wouldn't be thrown out of the Senate. And he would be reelected to go right back into the Senate the next election. After the beating, when he went home, when he got home, there were hundreds and hundreds of canes. People had sent, Southerners from all over had sent him canes, gold canes, sword canes, ivory canes, all kinds of different canes. And most of them would come with a little letter saying something like, "I heard you broke yours, so I thought you'd need another." So the Southerners were proud of him. The Southerners loved it. And he became a very popular figure in the South, and in the ideas of protecting slavery. And he was vilified in the Northern press, and the Northerners just saw him as a savage and really started thinking of the Southerners more and more as savages because of these kind of incidences. Um, so we have this machismo, this masculine ethos of honor and violence. It's a very, another source of difference. All right. So we have gotten from Jefferson to quite a few types, sources of difference. The next thing that I want to talk about is myth versus reality. All right. Most of what people think of is Old South as Southern histories in the 1800s, 1700s, the slave times, is referred to as the plantation legend, the Cavalier legend, or the Moonlights and Magnolias myth nowadays. Because during the 1800s, when historians first started writing down the history of the Old South, remember, there were more Southerners educated, and more Southerners had gone through college, and they were the professors and the historians that tended to write the histories. So their histories of the South glorified it. And this would continue all the way into the 20th century. I mean, you have the Charles Dunning School of Southern history that comes out of Chicago, the University of Chicago, that puts that spin of glory on the Old South, that they were fighting for the founding fathers' ideals of what America should be, that they were, living in a perfect land, that they were, the plantation owners were great men that took very good care of their slaves, that took care of their families, that made the economy of America thrive. So the historians that tended to be Southern glorified the Old South. And that kind of stuck. We really wouldn't get out of that until the 1960s, when revisionist historians came in and started really digging deep and looking at things and trying to come at it from not a nostalgic or sentimental, way, but through fact. And even in the textbooks, even to this day, some of the textbooks are still that old glorification instead of real history of the South. I mean, really think about it. You think when people think of the Old South, they think of these plantation owners in the big plantation house, the house slaves that are very loyal to the master. You got the field slaves, all the paintings that come out in the 1800s. Most of them showed the slaves dancing or having fun and doing stuff, and the plantation owner, he's sitting there overlooking everything with his sons and daughters and dog and wife, and it just, everything looks idyllic, everything looks beautiful, and everybody looks happy. And that's in many ways how it was promoted for the longest time. And in that story, that myth, and that legend, we even have the song, right? We listen to it in popular culture, Dixieland, way down south, it's the Dixieland song. I mean, it's like a TV show, right? Or a movie. You got to have a soundtrack. And the Old South has Dixieland as that soundtrack. So you can see in a lot of different ways how the Old South has been a glorified myth of a long gone and never existing American agrarian way of life. The reality is very different. All right. So what we're going to do is talk about the reality of the South. We're going to talk about the different groups. All right. With this, we have the planter elite. The planter elite are the ones that own 50 or more slaves. All right. The slave owners that own 50 or more, or a 11,000 people. All right. The people that owned 100 or more slaves were less than 2,000 people. So, all in all, you've got about, in the teens, like around 12 to 13,000 Southerners that own slaves. That group, that planter elite, made up 3/4 of 1% of the population. In other words, 3/4 of 1%, not even 1% of the population, owned the majority of slaves. They owned right around 90% of all the slaves. Just those 3/4 of 1% of the population. That planter elite not only did that, they owned almost all the land. They were also the ones that, controlled politics at the local, state, and national level. They're the ones that controlled the economy. So these people were basically Southern aristocrats. They controlled and had voice over everything, right? Also, then you had the average slave owner, all right? The average slave owner had about 4 to 6 slaves, and most of them wanted slaves because that's the only way they could participate. That was the only way they could participate in government in many states in the South. You had to own slaves to run for election, to be involved in politics. You had to own people. That was a way that the planters made sure that any politician in the South couldn't be anti-slave. So these average slave owners tended to be business owners that would get, that would do well for themselves, make more and more money, and then they would buy slaves to take care of the house. Be domestic slaves in the house and help around the stores, so they could be involved in that planter elite society. They were never accepted by the planter elite. They couldn't go hang out with them or anything. They're two different groups, but by owning slaves, they were allowed to participate in politics in the South. And that group, the average slave owner, the one that owned 4 to 6 slaves, it's really hard to get a solid estimate on them. They're somewhere between 10 to 18% of the Southern population. All right. So as you're looking at it, so right around somewhere between 11% to 19% of Southerners, of white Southerners, owned a slave. So somewhere between 11% to 19% of Southerners owned a slave, participated in politics, and were a part of that social, the upper part of that social hierarchy in the South. The main person, the average Southerner, were usually called plain folk or yeomen. They were farmers, simple subsistence level farmers. They owned their own land. They had, they built their log cabin. They had their land. They raised their crops. They raised their gardens. They hunted. They lived for themselves. They bartered and trade with other plain folk. So they lived that simple Jeffersonian ideal agricultural lifestyle. And that was around 65 to 85% of the Southern population. Nowadays, most push closer to 80% of the Southern, of that, anywhere from 70 to 80% of the South tended to be these plain folk or yeoman farmers, subsistence farmers. And then the last one we're going to talk about, back then they called them mountain folk or clay eaters. These were poor whites Basically what they would consider by the 20th century white trash. These are people that had no homes. They barely had any clothing. All they had was what they carried on them as they wandered the South looking for work and food. Um, they would be hired on to different plantations to work with the slaves so they'd get paid or food or however. Um, they were the most hated group. The planters, the average slave owner, the plain folk looked down on these clay eaters, these white trash, mainly because they were just vagabonds. They they didn't do anything. They were nicknamed clay eaters in the 1800s because they were so poor. I mean, some of them literally didn't even have clothes. They wandered around, like I said, looking for work with nothing, and they ate clay. Uh, Living here in Alabama, I'm sure you've seen the red clay, that thick, hard clay. They would eat the clay so it would sate their hunger. I mean, it would make them feel not hungry. This also shortened their life because once that clay got into their system, it hardened and it really couldn't come out. It would create blockages and they'd die. But that's where they get their nickname, is from something like that. So the reality of the situation is not that painting that you see or the stories that you hear about the Old South and the beloved patriarch, the plantation owner. We have these groups. We have the planter elite, we have the average slave owner, we have the plain folk, and we have the clay eaters. It's it's different. You got the myth, and that is the reality. All right, the last thing for the day is cotton. King cotton. This is your last key point, and the last thing we'll talk about. King cotton is the major part of the Southern economy, and it's one of the things that made America into an extremely rich nation. All right. To give you an idea, cotton made Southern planters more money than oil makes the modern economy today. All right. Cotton was what made industry go in the 1800s. Textile industries, right? They were everywhere, Europe, America, and everybody wanted Southern cotton. It was a blend. All right. It was a blended cotton that was more durable and softer than other cottons. And it could grow anywhere in the South and did. It was everywhere. Um, that was the 1800s. It wasn't always a crop that was feasible. Before the 1790s, it was not a feasible crop because cotton has those seeds, and it's to try to pull them out by hand. It just takes too much time. It makes it a worthless crop. But Eli Whitney would invent the cotton gin. With the cotton gin, all you had to do is dunk the cotton, the balls of cotton in there, and it would pull out. The machine would take out the seeds for you. That is when it would become a huge thing. You got to remember, this is the 1790s. By the 1790s, tobacco, rice, indigo, all the old crops were playing out. They had depleted the soil massively, and these plantations just weren't making the money that they had. And by the 1790s, there was talk of abolishing slavery. And they never got around to abolishing slavery because they thought that it would just go away on its own, that slavery wouldn't be around much longer, maybe a decade or two, and then no more. It would be gone. But this one invention, the cotton gin, changed everything, right? Cotton became the most important thing on the planet and made that planet eat. As Forrest Gump would put it, richer than God, right? So, once you get with this cotton gin and the founding fathers' willingness to ignore a problem an evil like slavery, it shows you what happens when you ignore your own problems, right? I mean, most people would just like to ignore them and hope they go away. But more often than not, those problems bite you in the ass. When they could have done something, they should have done something about slavery. When it was on its way out, they could have just ended it. They didn't. Along comes Eli Whitney with the cotton gin, and it's a whole new ball game. It's all changed. Slavery becomes more important than it ever before, and Southerners want more and more and more and more slaves as they grow more and more cotton. So, with this did not only make these planters rich, but it made the northern industries rich. They needed southern cotton, the textile industry in the north. So both the northern and southern economies were just booming and going crazy, making everybody lots of money. And it was all based on slave labor. And this plantation system moved away from the coastal places like Georgia, South Carolina, Virginia, and into the deep south, into our area, because cotton spread everywhere. All right, that is it for today, for this lecture. The next one, we're going to keep going with the Old South, and we're going to talk about the African American South during the 1700s and 1800s. Stay safe. Good luck. Goodbye.